Hello and good afternoon and welcome to the Foley Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse webinar. While everyone logs in, I'd like to just say thank you for attending today. This is our second webinar in this series related to the FMCSA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, and we will be getting going in just a minute. Attendance is very good, as was during the first session we had, so we appreciate all the interest from our customers and others in the industry, and we hope to certainly answer as many questions as you have over the course of today. All right, I see everyone logging in. During the webinar, I would just like to say that you will have the opportunity to submit questions, and we'll leave time at the end for answering as many as we can, but should we not be able to get to all of your questions, we will follow up with you through our blog or be able to post any answers directly back to you if you supply your information. Additionally, the webinar will be posted online for a review if you would like to go back to it and refer back to anything that's been covered today. All right, so with that out of the way, we will kick right off and launch into it. Firstly, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Scott Mogensen. I'm the Director of Drug and Alcohol Testing Compliance here at Foley. I've been here with Foley for several years now and really focused on DOT drug and alcohol testing compliance issues. At Foley, we manage drug and alcohol testing programs for over 25,000 regulated companies who require drug testing programs, and look forward to addressing issues specific to DOT regulated substance abuse programs. So definitely a key topic, and the hot one coming at us in the near future is this one, the Drug and Alcohol Testing Clearinghouse. So to jump right in, what is the Drug and Alcohol Testing Clearinghouse? That's a question that most of you are probably asking yourself or familiar with to some degree. But generally what the Drug and Alcohol Testing Clearinghouse is a database of CDL holders and the associated drug and alcohol testing violations that may or may not have been generated by those people. So basically the clearinghouse is administered and managed by the DOT, specifically the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and it will be going into effect January 6th of 2020, and that will mean that all violations generated for CDL holders on drug and alcohol tests, as well as violations of the prohibitions specified by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's drug testing rules, will be reported into the clearinghouse. Additionally, employers of CDL drivers will be required to query the clearinghouse when they're hiring a new driver, putting a driver into a role that is safety sensitive for the first time, or on an annual basis, they will be required to query the clearinghouse in order to ensure that they have the most up-to-date information on whether any violations exist that would prohibit them from using that driver. So this is a regulation that has been coming for a long time, and it will now be going into effect January 6th, 2020. So we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of what's involved as we go along. But as I mentioned, just a point on the timeline here, this is actually a regulation that was first published, a final rule that was first published December 5th of 2016. And that basically was when the requirements were put out in a final rule state. And during that time, in the interim since then, FMCSA has been building the clearinghouse and publishing a lot of helpful information on how carriers, drivers, and other parties in the industry will be able to interface with and comply with clearinghouse requirements. So the real effort began in earnest for most of us in the industry just this year in the fall of 2019. And what happened was registration opened up at the beginning of this month, October, where carriers, drivers, and other entities such as third-party administrators or medical review officers have been able to go in and register themselves in the clearinghouse. And we'll deal in a little more detail in a few minutes on what exactly that registration process entails and who has to do it. But that is open now. And then, as I mentioned before, January 6th, 2020 is when the clearinghouse goes into effect in earnest. That will be when required steps such as querying the clearinghouse start and submission of data into the clearinghouse begin. So that's the key date to circle on your calendar where a lot of the required activity begins. Another key point to have on the calendar is January 6th of 2023. So that's 3 years after the clearinghouse goes live. And what that really is significant for is the 3-year safety performance history investigation that motor carriers are today required to do on any of their drivers subject to drug and alcohol testing regulations. That request will be electronic only at that point. After the clearinghouse has been in effect for 3 years, that 3-year background check will cease to be a paper-based or fax-based or email-based, however you happen to do it today. Contacting those previous employers will no longer be a required step. Rather, the clearinghouse will be what is used to ascertain whether or not that driver is not allowed to perform a safety-sensitive function like driving. So we'll cover that in a little more detail, but these are the key dates to be aware of, specifically the one coming into effect this year, or I should say early next year, January 6th of 2020. So as we talk about the clearinghouse, it's important to keep in mind that there are a number of different parties that will be required to register, interact with the clearinghouse, and have ongoing activities inside the clearinghouse specific to each of their functions. And some of the key parties are listed here on this page. So registration will be required for employers and drivers, first off, those first 2 bullet points you see on your screen. So that basically means that every company, every motor carrier that employs CDL drivers must register themselves in the clearinghouse. So they'll have to go to the clearinghouse, they'll have to walk through the registration process, ensure that they've been registered there, and any other members of their organization who will have access and perform regular tasks in the clearinghouse will need to be added to your account. So there's a 2-factor authentication program that will go into effect there. So you can step through that process, and Foley will have help materials available upon request to be able to guide you through how that registration process will work. Similarly, the FMCSA has materials on the clearinghouse website at clearinghouse.fmcsa.dot.gov that will be helpful in identifying what the steps are. So employers have to register themselves. Drivers also will need to register themselves, and this is an important point because prior to performing a query, every driver must consent to the query being run on them. And in order to do that, a driver is going to need to have to register themselves in the clearinghouse, create a unique login for themselves with an email address, and set up their own account so that they can provide electronic consent to any full query that's run on them. So that's a key point, and we'll definitely drill into that. But it's a significant step that is going to be very important as we talk about the impacts to your business as an employer and potential impacts to your time to hire, which is an important consideration that we'll spend a good deal of time talking about how you mitigate that risk in terms of how your time to hire could be affected. Other parties that need to register include medical review officers, substance abuse professionals, third-party administrators, and state driver licensing agencies. So medical review officers, TPAs, substance abuse professionals are service agents in the industry that will help you administer your program. Each has a very specific function that they'll have to perform inside the clearinghouse, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what those might be. But they'll all need to register themselves, and in some cases, you may need to register who your third-party administrator is if you intend to have them help you and perform tasks as a third-party administrator for your company in the clearinghouse. Additionally, one point to touch on just briefly is that state driver licensing agencies will have access to the clearinghouse, and as the data in the clearinghouse becomes fleshed out over time, the information there will be referenced by licensing agencies at various states when they're processing new applications for commercial driver's licenses and renewals. So should a driver have any information in the clearinghouse which may exclude them as a driver, such as violations that have not been addressed, that license application may be impacted as the state driver licensing agency now has line of sight into drug and alcohol testing violations. Okay, moving on. The information in the clearinghouse is going to highlight a number of potential violations related to drug and alcohol testing, and some of those information points are listed here. Some of the key ones would include things like positive drug and alcohol test results. So we'll talk a little bit in detail about who submits them, but generally speaking, all positive drug and alcohol test results will be submitted into the clearinghouse and attached to the driver for which those results were generated. So those results will be available in the clearinghouse for years, and they will be accessible by any prospective employer looking to hire that driver. So the history of a driver will follow them from position to position, provided that they do not provided that they have not gone through the return to duty process. That information will still show to the prospective employer that a driver may not be qualified to perform safety sensitive functions. Additionally, there's some other information that can be submitted to the clearinghouse should it be applicable. This would be events such as reports of drivers who are driving under the influence of drugs or alcohol while on duty. So actual knowledge situations, as an example, where a driver may have been found to be under the influence, and the employer can report situations where they have actual knowledge into the clearinghouse and submit an incident report of that violation. Other prohibition violations, such as use of alcohol within 8 hours of an accident, should that event occur, a prohibition violation such as that can be reported into the clearinghouse. And similarly, any refusal of a drug or alcohol test, whether a refusal given to the employer when a driver is notified of a test they have to take, or a refusal at the collection site where perhaps a driver does not cooperate with the testing process and or leaves the site, that test could be deemed a refusal, and it will be reported into the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse on that driver's record. So all this information related to whether or not the driver is qualified and fit to drive based on 49 CFR Part 382 will be stored in the clearinghouse and accessible for any prospective employer looking to bring that driver on board. So having generally covered off what the clearinghouse is at a high level, what we're going to do next is spend a little bit of time looking at how queries are actually run and how an employee's record is checked within the clearinghouse. And specifically, one of the things we want to talk about here is how this process will be administered so that you get a good sense of what the impacts will be to your business in terms of actually executing this check in the clearinghouse if it's now required for you. And specifically, what we want everyone to think about as we run through this is what their plan is going to be for addressing it. If you need to talk with your service provider, which we highly recommend that you do, in order to plan what your execution plan will be, that is something we want you to think about as we go through this. And keep in mind that as we take all these steps, you want to think about how any potential delays in the execution of this or additional time added to this will impact your time to have your drivers on the road and your time to hire and add new drivers into driver positions. So with that, we'll kind of touch on the two key areas that cause queries to happen. First, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is anytime you hire a new driver, and that could mean hiring a new employee into your company, or adding a driver who was previously working for your company in a non-safety sensitive, non-CDL role. Before that driver begins performing safety sensitive functions, that would be driving a CDL vehicle, you're going to have to run a full clearinghouse check. And we'll discuss a little bit what the two different types of clearinghouse checks and queries are, but the full query is something that's going to be required on any new driver. Then, on an annual basis, at least once every 12 months, a company will have to query the clearinghouse on every driver that they employ. And that query will be a check to make sure that there's no new records that you're unaware of in the clearinghouse. So that check will be a limited check. And the limited check, I'll explain in a little bit, but it's a quicker, more cursory check just to ensure that there's no additional data that you're not aware of that's been submitted into the clearinghouse. Perhaps when a driver of yours applied to work at a different company and might have taken a pre-employment. Perhaps they had a positive drug test result on that pre-employment through a different company, and you might not be aware of the fact that that's something that's occurred while they were working for you. So that's the reason that FMCSA wants to ensure that every company is at least once a year querying the clearinghouse to make sure that they know if their drivers are currently qualified to be operating. Now, when we talk about these queries, these checks of the clearinghouse, one important concept to keep in mind is that a check of the clearinghouse is actually a background check on this individual and is subject to conditions of both the Privacy Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So not all provisions of these laws do apply, but certainly they do have impact on clearinghouse queries. So it's very important that you take the concept of consent importantly when thinking about querying the clearinghouse. There's requirements for receiving consent as an employer prior to performing either the limited or the full checks, and they have slightly different requirements which we'll drill into. But I do want to stress that there is significant impact here for the Fair Credit Reporting Act and any subsequent disclosure that might be necessary by you as the employer to that driver should you take any action based on information that you get from the clearinghouse. So there's a lot of nuance and specifics there, and it's important that you talk to your third-party administrator or industry partner to make sure that whatever practices or policies you'll have in place are compliant with both DOT regulation and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So that's a key point that I did want to stress here early. And as we talk about consent, just keep that in mind, that is a really critical part that you'll need to get in order to be compliant and protected. So the two types of clearinghouse queries, as I mentioned it before, that are really important here are the full clearinghouse check and the limited clearinghouse check. So the full clearinghouse query is the more detailed of the two. And when you run a full clearinghouse query, that will be a check of the driver's history and will include all details related to the drug and alcohol testing violations that that driver may have. And that will be required to be run in the case of a new driver coming on board. So when you have that pre-employment check that's being done, that is going to be a full clearinghouse query that's run on every new employee into your company. That clearinghouse query will require a full driver consent which is given electronically within the Clearinghouse portal itself. So that basically will mean that prior to the Clearinghouse query showing you the results, that driver will have to log in and electronically consent to the fact that they are specifically giving your company the authority to see their full record. And in order to do that, that driver will have to be registered and will have to have credentials to log into the Clearinghouse and consent and say that you as either the prospective or current employer has the right to view my full record. And that has to be done every single time a full Clearinghouse check is run. The second type is the limited Clearinghouse query. And the limited Clearinghouse query will return just summary information of whether or not there are records in the Clearinghouse for review on this driver. The limited query is run really for that annual requirement. So once every 12 months, you have to run a limited query on your drivers, and that will basically just return that summary information to say either no records exist on this person and he or she is good to continue driving, or it may come back and say there are actually records in the Clearinghouse. There are new pieces of data that have been added to the Clearinghouse, and in that event, you would then, within 24 hours, need to run a full query on that driver. So just to say that again, if that limited Clearinghouse query returns a hit and shows that this driver does have records, you would actually need to go and make sure that within 24 hours, you go back and run that full Clearinghouse check. Should more than 24 hours go by between the time you run the limited check and the time that you're able to execute that full Clearinghouse query, you would need to actually pull that driver off the road and ensure that they're not performing safety sensitive functions until either they do consent to giving you that Clearinghouse query, you do have a chance to run it and see that they're clean, or should they refuse consent, they must be pulled from that safety sensitive role and they won't be allowed to drive. Similar to a situation where a driver refuses a drug test result, you cannot use somebody who refuses to grant you consent to do a required check as an employer. So one of the key points that I do want to highlight is the actual nature of the consent. So again, on the full Clearinghouse query, there is a requirement that the driver consent within the Clearinghouse. That's electronic, and the driver must log in to do that. The limited check that's done on an annual basis does not require the driver within the Clearinghouse to electronically consent to have their record run. However, you do require a general consent from that driver, which can be kept outside of the Clearinghouse, either on paper or electronic means, which gives you as the company, the employer, the right to query and run limited query runs on that driver over the course of your employment. So it has to be time bound. It has to specify you as the employer. It's probably recommended that that's something that you have new employees sign off on at the time of hire just to get that into their file. But however you manage it, you will need that consent for the limited query. It's just not something that's inside the Clearinghouse. You'll have to manage it outside the Clearinghouse. So either way, you're going to need consent, whether you're running the full or the limited, but the consents are different. But it is very important that regardless of which type you're running, you have the appropriate consent before querying that Clearinghouse. All right. So basically, those are the types of queries that are run and generally the type of information that's in the Clearinghouse. What we really want to spend some time on now is how your compliance programs will be impacted and change as a result of these new requirements to query the Clearinghouse. So first and foremost, it's important to understand that your employer programs are going to be impacted, and they're going to be impacted in a couple key ways. First and foremost, that pre-employment process is going to feel some impact to this. As I said before, every new driver that you bring into a safety sensitive role, if they're a CDL driver, you're going to need to execute and receive the results of that Clearinghouse query prior to putting that driver on the road. And that is an added step with added requirements, and it's going to insert time into your process. So it's very important, and we highly recommend that all carriers think about how they're going to execute that process to really make sure that their time to get somebody on the road in this competitive job market for drivers when there's a driver shortage is not impacted by the fact that you do now have to do this extra step in the hiring process. Secondly, there's this annual review process that you're going to have to manage. So as I said before, every year, at least every year, every 12 months, you're going to need to ensure that your drivers have a limited query run on them to meet the FMCSA's requirement and make sure that those drivers are fit to drive and stay on the road. So making sure you stay on top of that, making sure that's done on time and properly with the appropriate consent is something that's important and you should plan ahead for. And something also to keep in mind is obviously the fact that this is a database now managed by the FMCSA. So any company not performing this annual task that's required will likely be visible to the FMCSA, and inactive accounts or employers that are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, there'll be increased visibility on the FMCSA's part to non-compliance in this regard. So it's important that carriers take this seriously. And then finally, it's important to realize that as you're managing the driver's drug and alcohol testing program, there are very specific things that will be different about how the program is actually administered, and violations are added into the clearinghouse by the employer in the case where it's an employer submitted document. So first on the list, like we said before, was those pre-employment process changes. So we've touched on this a couple times, but it bears repeating that at every time you bring a new driver into your program, you're going to have to run that full clearinghouse query. So again, that's very similar to a pre-employment drug test result where it's got to be done and you have to have the results in hand, and they have to be positive, good results where the driver has no violations on their record that would prohibit them from driving, and you've got to see that prior to putting them on the road. And then what's really important is this consent aspect. So because it's a background check, because it's a full query that the clearinghouse manages consent for, that driver is going to need to actually log into the clearinghouse and consent. So, one of the key things to point out here from a planning perspective for motor carriers is the fact that in order for your driver or your applicant to consent to your pre-employment query as quickly as possible, they really need to be registered. So they need to make sure that they've gone in and registered themselves as drivers so that they will receive that consent request, and they'll have the ability to log in and quickly consent so that you can get the result back as the employer. If they're not registered within the clearinghouse, they'll have to do so in order to consent. And should they not be electronically registered, they may even have to wait for a US mailed letter going through the postal system to arrive at the address on their CDL license, notifying them of the fact that your company is trying to run a full clearinghouse query on them and they are not registered. So, obviously that adds time to the process, and without that consent, you cannot employ them and put them behind the wheel of that truck. So it's critically important in order to preserve the speed and effectiveness of your hiring process to ensure that you're making your drivers as aware as possible, you're covering it off in your hiring process, and you're communicating to all of the drivers that could be operating for you of the need to get registered and the need to consent for this pre-employment check. As we know that sometimes it's hard to wrangle a large number of drivers to either perform a required task or submit required information. So you should plan ahead and try to think about how you're going to stay on top of this and make sure that you're not stuck waiting for consents But instead, when you need to run a check, your drivers are logging in as quickly as possible. So the next point we'll touch on is the 3-year background check requirement. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but it bears repeating that when a company is hiring a new driver today, they have to perform a 3-year background check, a safety performance history investigation into that driver's conduct at his previous 3 years worth of DOT regulated employment. And today that usually takes the form of contacting the previous employers by either phone or fax or email and asking them some key questions that are defined by the regulations. So, those questions deal with, has this driver ever tested positive on a drug test result before? Have they completed the return to duty process if they did so? And, other information related to whether or not that driver is fit to operate. Well, in the next 3-year period from 2020 to 2023, that 3-year background check requirement is going to remain unchanged. So if you're doing it today on a driver, you're going to need to continue doing it. And in addition to that 3-year background check history, you're going to need to query the clearinghouse. So you have these dual requirements between January 6th, 2020 and January 6th, 2023, where carriers will have to be doing both processes. Now, you might be asking the question, if I have a non-CDL driver where I'm today performing this 3-year background check on, and I'm bringing them in and assembling their driver file, but they have no DOT regulated experience in the past where I have to go back and ask a previous employer, do I have to query the clearinghouse? And the simple answer is no. If they don't have DOT regulated experience where they were subject to drug and alcohol testing regulations before, a clearinghouse query doesn't need to be run. It's only on drivers that have FMCSA drug and alcohol testing history. And I point that out because this is an FMCSA requirement subject only to drivers of commercial motor vehicles. If you have employees that are subject to DOT regulations for drug testing under different modalities, such as the Federal Railroad Administration or the Federal Aviation Administration, the 3-year, or actually in that case, it would be the 2-year safety performance history investigations that you're performing on those employees today would remain unchanged. This is only going to be a requirement for drivers of commercial motor vehicles that hold CDLs. So as I said before, this 3-year background check to the previous employers will remain in force for the next 3 years, and the clearinghouse queries will be required. And then in January 6th of 2023, the 3-year background check requirement can be fulfilled only using the clearinghouse. So you can stop doing the request to the previous employers for that information beginning in January of 2023. That would be after 3 years worth of history is submitted into the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. So that's a little ways out, but it is something down the road that will hopefully reduce the amount of previous employment requests that go out. And additionally, one point to raise is just that the clearinghouse will increase the ability of motor carriers to accurately get violations on drivers, where in the past, the driver might have omitted to mention an employer they worked for. Now the clearinghouse will capture all that information, and you as the employer will be able to see that and ensure that you're fully aware of what is in that driver's past. So the next section we're going to talk about is ongoing driver management changes. So, as we mentioned before, third-party administrators or the employers themselves must execute this annual query on the entirety of the driver's employment, which basically means that you're going to get any information for any of your existing employers, and that is going to be showing you any information that either you've submitted, which normally you would know about, or information that's been submitted by other employers on drivers that you're currently employing. So again, the situation I brought up earlier was the potential where a driver of yours might have applied to work for a different company. Or perhaps you employ a driver that also has another job driving a CDL vehicle for a different company simultaneously. And should another violation occur on that other employer's program, you'll need to run this annual clearinghouse query every year to catch any of those potential situations and be aware of anything the driver may not have disclosed to you. These queries, as I mentioned before, can be a limited query. You're also entitled to run a full query if you so choose. I haven't mentioned it yet in this webinar, but the FMCSA will actually be collecting a fee for each query that you run through the clearinghouse, and that pricing is visible on the clearinghouse website itself and will be payable directly to the FMCSA. The clearinghouse will basically charge $1.25 per query, and that will be the same regardless of whether it's a full query or a limited check. So we'll talk a little bit further as we move along, but those query plans are going to be available for purchase directly from the FMCSA very soon. But in terms of this annual requirement, you are entitled to run the limited check where you don't require consent on every query that you run, or if you so choose, you can run that full query at least once a year. So other program changes that are relevant that we should talk about include some of these items. First off, as the employer, you have the ability to supply information into the clearinghouse yourself as the employer, or you can designate a third-party administrator, such as Foley, to supply that information into the clearinghouse on your behalf. So that would mean that you can designate who your third-party administrator is, and they'll have rights to submit information under certain circumstances. Now, when violations occur, either the employer or the third-party administrator that has been designated needs to get that information submitted into the clearinghouse within 3 days. So it is very timely and important that that information gets submitted right away into the clearinghouse. And reportable information that could be submitted includes some of the items listed below. So specifically, positive drug test results will be reportable. As the employer, you just need to ensure that the MRO, the medical review officer that you are using for your drug testing, will be submitting that information directly into the clearinghouse. So it's a medical review officer requirement to make sure that all those positive verified drug test results get submitted into the clearinghouse immediately and are attached to the driver based on the CDL number, which will be the key piece of data that's used to tie all the information together. Beyond that, some of the next items are actually going to be submitted by the employer, by you yourself. So the next one is alcohol results. So positive alcohol results don't go through a medical review officer. They're generated directly by the breath alcohol technician, and anything with a concentration of 0.04 or greater, which typically is considered a violation under DOT, will need to be submitted into the clearinghouse as a violation by the employer or by their designated TPA. Refusals to test, same thing. The employer or the TPA on their behalf will need to submit that information directly into the clearinghouse on any driver that's refused to take a test. And that covers the whole range of different refusal situations from not reporting to the collection site to outright denying when the employer requests that the test be taken to non-cooperation with the collection site during the actual testing event. All of that information needs to be submitted into the clearinghouse. The employer or their third-party administrator that they've designated and contracted with will have the ability to submit a incident report, which includes a written description of the event. There'll need to be something called a certificate of service, which basically shows that the driver was notified of the fact that this is being deemed a refusal. And any type of supporting information, including audio or visual content, can be submitted into the clearinghouse to back up that violation. Similarly, actual knowledge violations, where perhaps a driver admits to you that they, as an employee, have violated a prohibition of FMCSA's drug testing program, or you actually directly observe this happening. In either of those cases, that would constitute actual knowledge. And if you do, as an employer, have actual knowledge of a prohibition violation, you can submit that violation report directly into the clearinghouse. Similarly, after providing documentation that you've notified the driver and with some supporting information of when and how this event actually occurred. And finally, the employer will have the ability to submit return to duty results and a report of the completion of the follow-up program. Should there be a driver who is going through the return to duty process, you will be able to basically note that these key steps, the return to duty and the follow-up program, have been completed, so that a driver with a violation in their past can have their clearinghouse record updated to show that they have taken the required steps to remediate the situation, and they're now able to operate in a compliant manner. So all of this information needs to be reported to the clearinghouse on a regular basis if and when it occurs. And again, it's important that you as the employer either think about how you're going to plan to get this information into the clearinghouse, or you speak to your providers and partners and talk about what options they have available to help them get this information into the clearinghouse. Because again, the time frame is very short, ensuring that it's submitted in a proper manner, and it is a DOT requirement. So you want to make sure that in order to remain compliant, you are following the rules and making sure that all the information is submitted appropriately. So with that, I think what we should probably get into next is talking about how we can help simplify the process by issuing some guidance that Foley considers best practice. And even if you're not using Foley, it's worthwhile thinking about how these steps could be useful to you in terms of talking with your provider and thinking about what steps you should focus on to make sure the clearinghouse rollout is as painless as possible for you. So, why does this matter to plan ahead? Well, it's pretty simple actually. The driver shortage is a key factor in our industry at the moment, and driver positions are very competitive. So any type of situation that becomes a barrier to a motor carrier securing the best driver talent will be a really key factor in the success of that motor carrier's business. You want to get the best drivers and get them into the positions and the roles that you have available as quickly and efficiently as possible. We hear that from our customers all the time, and it's really a key differentiator in the carriers that are successful versus those that struggle is basically how can you quickly and effectively onboard good drivers. And obviously the clearinghouse is going to be a good thing for the industry because it's going to ensure that the safest, most compliant drivers are the ones that are going to be available to drive. But the flip side of that coin is that it is really going to add more steps to the process to ensure that you're running those checks quickly and efficiently and doing it and getting the results back prior to putting them on the road. So, the timeliness and the manner in which you actually execute these queries is something that you want to have planned out in advance, because it could turn into a lot of work and you don't want it to delay your process for effectively and efficiently hiring your drivers. So again, that consent process, making sure you communicate with your drivers, making sure that you have all of the required steps figured out and you know who's going to be executing these queries is really a best practice that you should plan for and document in your company. So how can a TPA help on this? Well, Clearly, a good partner will take on a lot of this responsibility in terms of being able to offer a service where they can help really eliminate some of these pain points. So, speaking for Foley, this is something that we've put a lot of focus into. It's been 3 years coming, and we've really planned ahead on how we can help carriers deal with these issues and identify some of the key bottlenecks that could crop up and try to find ways to mitigate them. So, again, as I mentioned, the clearinghouse is going to be a positive change, but you want to make sure that you have a partner to take on a lot of the key responsibilities, such as obtaining that driver consent. As I mentioned before, you're going to need to have the drivers registered in the clearinghouse in order to submit the full query and get the results back. You're also going to need to obtain that limited consent so that on an annual basis, you can run a query on every driver that you currently employ. And you're going to want to make sure that you have that in advance so you're not scrambling for it, the day you need to run that query. So making sure you think through with your partner how you're going to actually get that consent managed on all of your drivers is a key step you should be taking. Actually running the clearinghouse queries is another thing. The execution of them. Who from your company is going to log in, or better yet, who can you hire to basically do this for you? So your third-party administrator, if you designate them, will be able to launch these queries. So make sure you've worked out with your TPA how these queries are actually going to get run, when they're going to be kicked off, and make sure you have a plan for that. And then finally, reporting driver violations. Hopefully these will not be something that you have to deal with very many of. I hope all your drivers are violation free as long as possible, but I think it's likely that at some point over the next couple of years, you're going to have to deal with submitting driver violations into the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. And having a plan for that in advance will help that be as painless a process as possible. So think through who's going to be submitting these, how you're going to capture the information related to the violation, and what are the steps going to be that are going to be followed to ensure that you both have this handled in a compliant and effective manner. One point I will add here while we're talking about TPAs is the option to designate a third-party administrator to do some of this work for you as the motor carrier is present for any motor carrier other than an owner-operator. So another way to say that is most motor carriers have the choice of whether they designate a TPA or whether they handle it themselves. Owner-operators, which is defined as any company where the owner is a driver, is required to designate a third-party administrator in the clearinghouse. And that's a step that's done during the registration process, where you're basically going to have to pick your third-party administrator if you're an owner-operator, and that owner-operator will have to do certain functions on your behalf. So an example would be reporting driver violations. So should you as the owner-operator happen to have a positive alcohol test result, FMCSA would require your TPA to submit that information into the clearinghouse instead of relying on the owner-operator to submit it themselves. So that's an important step. Most of you, if you are owner-operators, will likely not have an issue, being that you're going to want to maintain your compliance and your eligibility to drive. So you won't really have to worry about violations as much, but the step of designating that TPA will be a required step, and again, something that's highly visible to the DOT. So make sure you plan for that if you are an owner-operator. The registration process, again, will ask you that question of whether you are an owner-operator, and will require you to make that registration and designation step as you're entering your company's registration. So other things to think about when you're talking about how you're going to plan to get this work done is, ask your TPA whether or not they are able to help you with the full gamut here, whether it's the clearinghouse registration assistance, whether there's a process that they can put together to help streamline the gathering of that electronic consent as the drivers are brought on board, so that you can run the limited queries with the electronic consent that you captured outside of the clearinghouse, which is good for the duration of employment. The FCRA and Privacy Act knowledge is also an important step here. You want to make sure that you have that covered off, and you've spoken to experts as it relates to your steps that are going to be required. And then, what is your process for actually executing the annual reviews? Is there a way that your TPA can help you stay on top of which drivers you've run reviews for and run those limited checks for? Make sure you don't miss anyone. And anything that can facilitate uploading the driver violation information, whether it's your third-party administrator doing it, or whether there's a process to help gather that information so it's less tedious for you to put that information together. So again, just generally make sure that you're speaking with your partners here in the industry, or your third-party administrator that you currently have, whether that's Foley or someone else, and talk through what the options are for how they can help you get this done, because while you could do it yourself, provided you're not an owner-operator, it could be a lot of work, and you want to make sure that you've got all your I's dotted and T's crossed. One other point that we do want to make here is there is a argument to be made for using more than just the minimum required clearinghouse queries, and really making sure that you use the clearinghouse as an advantage for your company. So, a couple points that we've seen in the industry is a spike in post-accident positivity rates. And, one of the things that really calls out is the potential possibility of improving the safety and the lowered accident rate that might be possible with more monitoring of your driver's drug and alcohol behavior. So, as I mentioned before, the clearinghouse will require that you run at least one limited check every 12 months, but you could choose to run more than just the minimum and run multiple limited queries a year, just ensuring that your drivers don't have any information that's been reported by a different company into the clearinghouse, and that information may have been submitted shortly after you last ran a check on one of your current drivers. Instead of waiting 12 months, maybe you run it every quarter and find out sooner whether you have a driver that might be disqualified. That is, again, not a required step, but since drivers often work for multiple companies, you may not necessarily know if they violated the drug testing program for FMCSA while applying to work at a different company. So that's an option that's up to you. FMCSA's pricing, as I mentioned before, is a flat $125 per query, so that's payable directly to FMCSA. But should you choose to do that, that may be a tool that you can use to get some benefit out of the clearinghouse requirements, as they come into effect here in 2020. All right, so we're closing up here towards the end of the hour session. But it looks like we do have a fair number of questions that have been submitted. So I will just take a second here to gather some of the information, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. Should we have, and it looks like we will have more questions that everyone on the webinar today has submitted, then I'm probably going to get a chance to answer. We will go ahead and follow up as we did on the first version of this webinar in our blog with any key points that we don't discuss here in the Q&A session. But the first question that I see here that really got answered or asked is, if I get a hit on the query, what is the next step? So I'm going to assume that the person asking this question is referring to a limited query, which would be run on your current employees at least once every 12 months. And the answer there is, if you do get a hit on one of the limited queries, you're going to have to then, within 24 hours, run a full query on that same driver. And that's a step that basically will drill into the detail of what the new records, what the new information in that clearinghouse really is on that driver. And likely, if you find that there is some type of disqualifying information, you would have to pull that driver off the road and ensure that they've either been made aware of this information, or had a chance to go through the return to duty process to become a eligible driver again to perform a safety sensitive function. And just in the event that the questioner was asking about what do you do if you get a hit on a full query, obviously if there is information returned in a full query that indicates the driver had tested positive on a drug or alcohol test or refused or something of that regard, you would not be able to use that driver until they go through the return to duty process. Similar to today, if you run that 3-year safety performance history and you get the same result, that driver is going to need to perform return to duty prior to getting back on the road. All right, so next question is, will I need to make any changes to my drug and alcohol testing policy? And that's a great question, and the answer is yes. There will be requirements to either update your current drug and alcohol policy that you have for your company, or issue an addendum to that policy to update it for the clearinghouse specifically. So there are a number of points that you have to address, and I probably won't have time to spell them all out on this session, but we will be providing more information on exactly what those items are. And should you happen to be a Foley customer listening to this webinar, we will be providing addendums to our template policy to cover off these items. But generally speaking, you need to make sure that you've notified your drivers that the clearinghouse exists, what the types of situations are that you'll have to query the clearinghouse for, what the consequences will be of not consenting should a driver choose to not consent, and generally speaking, what types of information will be present in the clearinghouse. So those types of details will need to be added to your drug and alcohol policy, and you'll need to get the drivers to either acknowledge or sign off on an addendum to that policy to show that they have been made aware of the clearinghouse changes. All right, so moving on to the next question here. When do I need to start the annual limited queries for current drivers? That's the next question. And that's a very good question. So as I mentioned earlier, the clearinghouse will go into effect January 6th of 2020. So, a little less than 3 months from now. And that will be the opening of the clearinghouse where new violations will need to be submitted as they occur, and pre-employment queries will need to start being performed. But specific to this question, the annual limited queries will need to be run at least once in the first 12 months that the clearinghouse is operational, after January 6th of 2020. So, put that a different way, and it basically means you'll need to have run your first limited query at least before January 6th, 2021. So somewhere in the first 12 months, you'll have to run your first limited query. And since you need to run one to comply with FMCSA, it probably makes sense to run it a little bit later in the year, since the beginning portions, the beginning of the year, there'll be less information in the clearinghouse, since there will just have been less time for carriers to submit information into the clearinghouse. So again, first limited query, you have until January 5th of 2021 to get that done. All right, so we're right at the top of the hour here, and we have a number of other questions. I apologize, we're not going to be able to get through all of them. But I do want to thank everyone for logging in today and participating in this session. We have a lot of interest in the clearinghouse, as I'm sure is present throughout the industry, as this is a really new and dynamic change to the DOT drug testing requirements. Certainly, we want to make sure we're always available to answer your questions. So I've put a phone number here up on the screen. Should you have any additional information that you want to get answered, or should you be a Foley customer and you want to talk about how we can help you comply with the clearinghouse and meet the obligations as an employer that you have placed upon you, feel free to reach out. We're happy to talk and make sure that everyone gets their questions answered. So with that, I will wrap up and just again thank you everyone for participating. We appreciate it, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you.